Hello again, everybody. So the topic for today is what is knowledge? And for our reading, I have assigned Plato's Theaetetus, which is the sort of classical source, we call it, for what we call the analysis of knowledge. That is an answer to the question, what is knowledge? How do we define knowledge? How do we find the necessary conditions and the sufficient conditions for what knowledge is? Basically, we're looking for a definition of knowledge. And in Plato's Theaetetus, Plato writes some characters interacting with Socrates, the classical Greek philosopher figure. And Socrates is dialoguing with them and asking them to see if they can come up with a definition of knowledge. And so he'll go through, it turns out that there are at least 4 definitions that he considers for what knowledge could be. And they decide that all of them are somewhat inadequate. But the last one that we end up with is one that philosophers often think of as the classical account. We'll see next time a contemporary objection, a contemporary problem with that mostly accepted 4th definition of knowledge. But for now, we're just going to go through the ones that are in Plato. Just as an aside, there are many cultures that have tried to come up with definitions of knowledge. We're focusing on the Western account partly because that's the one that's clearly and easily explainable for me, but I think that maybe in a future video I will try to outline some alternative conceptions of knowledge and how they maybe relate to this problem. This dialogue is named the Theaetetus because Socrates is dialoguing with this young man named Theaetetus. So the dialogue is named after him. And Theaetetus is going to be prompted to try to give a definition of knowledge. He's mostly going to stumble and have a really hard time doing this, which is classic in these Platonic dialogues. Socrates' interlocutors have a lot of trouble answering Socrates' questions, even though in the beginning of the dialogue they sure think that they're going to come up with a solution. I will first outline the 4 different definitions that he attempts, and then I will go through each one and explain how in the dialogue we come up with difficulties for each of these attempted definitions. So the first definition that Theaetetus tries to give is that knowledge is craft and skill. The second definition that Theaetetus tries to give is that knowledge is perception. The third definition that Theaetetus tries to give is that knowledge is true judgment. And the 4th definition that Theaetetus tries to give is that knowledge is true judgment with an account. The things of which there are no account are not knowable, he says. So the first attempted definition is that knowledge is craft and skill. And Socrates objects to this definition because he thinks that that is an example of knowledge. It's a case in which we describe someone as having knowledge, but it is not the definition of knowledge. So for instance, suppose that I asked you for a definition of a rose, and rather than, give me a sentence or anything, you just said, well, this one over here, that's a rose. Listen, buddy, that's not a rose definition, that's an actual rose. I didn't ask you for an example of a rose, I wanted a definition. So how is the attempted definition that knowledge is craft and skill not a definition? Well, Socrates just thinks that those are examples of people having knowledge. So if you have a craft that you can do, or if you have a skill acquired that allows you to say, like, make furniture or climb a mountain, those are examples of how you know things, but they don't tell us what is common to all accounts of when someone knows something. Theaetetus at first feels a little uncomfortable with this process. He's like feeling unable to answer this question in the way that he can very skillfully answer questions about mathematics, and he acknowledges this difference. And Socrates tells him in a rather interesting passage that he's uncomfortable because he's in, quote, intellectual labor, and that Socrates is going to act as the midwife and help him give birth finally to these better formed intellectual ideas that hopefully he will produce. So the second definition of knowledge that we try out in this dialogue is that knowledge is perception. So what's wrong with the second account, that knowledge is perception? This account sort of sounds a little bit like an account given by Protagoras, who was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was an itinerant teacher who went around claiming to be able to teach students things about wisdom and things about rhetoric and public speaking and other skills having to do with statesmanship and citizenship. And Protagoras was understood to have proposed that man is the measure of all things. And this was frequently ridiculed. Why? Well, if man is the measure of all things, if individual subjective perception determines everything that's true, it would seem like we wouldn't be able to get at the truth. And knowledge, if you think about it, requires us having a grasp on what is genuinely real, right? Knowledge seems to have as a prerequisite that something that you know is true. If something that you know is merely like your subjective belief, that's exactly what we think is failing to know. So now when we turn to the suggestion that maybe knowledge is identical with perception, we see similar, if slightly distinct, issues with the account attributed to Protagoras. So the basic formula that we're suggesting is that if I know a certain thing X, then that's the same as saying that I perceive a certain thing X. So for example, if I know that I'm cold, then I perceive that I am cold. But notice how perception seems relative to the perceiver. If we're sitting on opposite sides of a particular scene, you will see certain things happening that I won't necessarily see the same way because we don't have the same perspective. Our perception is perspective relative in many cases. Not in all cases, perhaps, but let's put that aside for now. So it seems like knowledge would be subjective if it's true that knowledge is identical with perception. But for knowledge, we usually want to be in touch with reality. And so it would seem like there would be an appearance and reality gap, right? But there doesn't seem to be an appearance-reality gap with knowledge like there is with perception. Let's defend the knowledge is perception view for a second, because we don't want to be unfair. We want to be good philosophers. Why is one positive reason why we might think knowledge is perception? Consider this argument that they're equivalent. Premise 1, perception is inseparable from the perceiver, whatever that means. Premise 2, only the perceiver can judge what is perceived. And that seems true, right? Like only someone seeing something can judge what it is that they are seeing. No one else can get inside your head when you're witnessing a scene and tell you what you're seeing. Only you can do that for yourself. 3, there is no room for error in judging your own perception. That seems right the first time that you think about it, right? So no one else can be more right about what you're sensing than you. That's because you have a kind of privileged perspective on your own perception. Up until someone successfully produces a complete neuroscientific picture of perception, it would seem really, really hard, even for a neuroscientist, to tell you better than you yourself know what it is that you're perceiving. Therefore, the account goes, I know by means of perceiving. I know things because I perceive them. There's an additional consequence to this argument, which is that knowledge is always in flux, because perception is always in flux. I'm perceiving this gardening glove. In looking at it, can learn all sorts of things about this gardening glove. I can learn that it's green and this kind of grayish color. It's got a purple rim. It's got words on it. In seeing the glove, like my perception is changing all the time, and in a sense, the things that I immediately am able to know by means of my perception is also changing all the time. So my knowledge is always in flux because my perception is always in flux, but it is knowledge nonetheless. But there are at least 2 objections besides this positive argument for why perception can't be the same as knowledge and vice versa. First of all, let's talk about the objection based on memory. Consider the following. If someone remembers what was known through perception, one knows whatever content it is that one remembers. But from the above that we considered, right, if it is true, then perception is knowledge. So when the perception is finished, the knowledge is gone. So in memory, it seems like one would know and not know the same thing. But that's impossible. How can you know and not know the same thing at the same time? That's a contradiction. So knowledge can't equal perception by reductio ad absurdum. Reductio ad absurdum is an argumentative technique where we assume the thing that is trying to be proved and we see what follows from it. And in a reductio ad absurdum argument, we reduce that assumption to nothing because that assumption turns out to lead us to contradictions along with other plausible assumptions that we were already willing to accept. So reductio ad absurdum shows that we can't assume the thing in question, that we can't assume in this case that knowledge is perception because it leads to absurdities. Here's a second objection to the knowledge is perception view. It's the objection from false opinion. Consider the following. Everyone thinks some others are wiser and some others are less wise than themselves. This behavior assumes a difference between true opinion and false opinion. But in order to equate knowledge with perception, you have to deny this distinction. If man is the measure is true, right? If we individually are each the thing that decides what is true, then common practice, like dismissing some people as foolish, measures it as false, right? Anytime that we think someone else is being silly or dumb or misled, we are judging them to believe something false. We are judging them not to know. But if we say that the opinion of others is false, then we deny that man is the measure, right? Because the other person is also a person, and we are saying that they are not the measure. Thus, it can't be true that perception is knowledge because we're saying that other people can misperceive, that is, their own perceptions can mislead them. Because the person who holds that man is the measure, right, must grant that others have true opinions sometimes. To avoid this paradox, we should grant that people can differ in their wisdom. That is to say, that people can be mistaken. In order to get a positive account of knowledge, we need to allow that whatever the source of our knowledge is can be fallible. We can sometimes get things wrong. And so getting things right requires a little bit more than just the process by which we acquire said knowledge. Consider this very final argument that knowledge is not perception. And this final argument will lead us to a clue about maybe what will be a better analysis of knowledge. So first of all, each type of perception is distinct from the rest. Right? Various senses perceive different kinds of objects. So my eyes perceive the visual properties of objects, like color and shape. And my smell, for example, perceives olfactory properties of objects. Some objects that are pretty looking smell bad, and some objects that are ugly looking smell good. What's important is that my perception can give me different kinds of information about objects depending on what sort of perception that I'm using. But to know that that is true, that is, that I get different types of information from different parts of my perception, that can't itself be perception, right? To know, for example, that sounds are different from colors can't be an act of perception. What we're doing is that we're detecting similarity and difference. Sometimes our perception can be a means of detecting similarity and difference, but knowing that colors and sounds are different from each other is sort of an additional ability we have on top of the ability to perceive colors and sounds themselves. And what sort of thing is the concept of similarity? Is it a perceptual thing? Well, no, because our judgments of things being similar and dissimilar applies to objects often that are not objects of perception. For example, think about how a country and a nation are similar concepts, but they're not identical. right? A country is something that has a particularly defined form of government. Maybe statehood is an important feature of a country. I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not going to say anything further than that. But the concept of a nation is a slightly different one than the concept of a country. A country can be both a nation and a country, but in the modern day, many countries contain many different nations. For instance, groups of people who share an ethnic identity can sometimes be classified as a nation. And so you have some countries that are nation states, but countries and nations are different from each other. And what we've done just there is analyzed, maybe imperfectly, the similarity and dissimilarity of two concepts. But countries and nations aren't things that we have as concepts for purely perceptual reasons. You can't perceive the country of the United States. You can perceive the word the United States, right? So it seems like in judging similarity and difference, we're not using purely perceptual capacities. There must be something else that we're doing. In Plato, this gets called a power. We have a power that is not a perceptual power, that we use to apply the idea of what he calls the universal of similarity to these other types of objects, these concepts. Therefore, we know that some things are known without being sensed or perceived, or at least not only because they're sensed or perceived. Therefore, knowledge has to be different from perception. So now we have to jump to the third attempted definition of knowledge that we come to in the Theaetetus. This third definition is that knowledge then might be a true judgment. Another way to put this other proposal for what knowledge is knowledge is true belief. So we can parse this as knowledge is true judgment or knowledge is true belief. There's some translators who disagree about the best way to translate it, but for the time being, I'll take them to be equivalent. We first need to understand what is meant here by judgment. So a judgment is now the word for the thing that we do, the kind of mental decision, the sort of mental assertion of something being the case. So I might perceive objects in the world, like this glove that we were talking about earlier. I'm sensing all sorts of things about it, but I might judge something about it in a way that's different from my sensing it. So I might judge that this glove is uninteresting, for example. My judgment that it's uninteresting is different from my perception of the glove. Now my judgment is a different kind of mental activity. So when we say that knowledge is a true judgment, what we're saying is that my judgment contains some information or some content, something that I am saying, maybe mentally saying about the world or an object or a concept, something I am asserting about it, and then we're saying that assertion now is going to be true in some cases and false in other cases. So sometimes it's going to correspond to reality, and other times it's not going to correspond with reality. So the assessment that knowledge is true judgment is saying that knowledge is when I judge something, like that this glove is uninteresting, and that judgment turns out to correspond to reality. So it either will be the case that the glove is uninteresting, in which case I have knowledge on this account, or it will not be the case. Maybe the glove is interesting and I'm just kind of dumb and I'm missing something important about this glove, in which case I don't have knowledge. Socrates is ready with a counterexample, though. Socrates points out that this doesn't work 100%, because sometimes you might have a true judgment, but we wouldn't call the true judgment that you've made knowledge. Suppose that you have a case in front of a court. You've got a jury who's deciding whether or not a certain set of events really happened. There's a witness testimony, the witness has claimed certain things have happened, and it's the jury's job to decide, whether or not something really has happened, whether or not someone really is guilty. So suppose that the jury is persuaded of something, and they might judge in that case, when the jury's being good, they might judge well and properly and truly, right? They might judge, yes, as a matter of fact, the defendant did enter that shop unlawfully, did threaten the owner of the shop unlawfully, and did steal some money, right? And maybe that is actually what happened, and they judge that, and so the person is ruled to be guilty, and so they've formed a true judgment. But Socrates points out that doesn't necessarily mean that the jury knows what the witness that testified knows. The witness was there. Maybe the witness is the shop owner. Maybe the witness is the shop owner's spouse. It's been brought before the jury and they've said exactly what they saw happening. And the jury has truly judged that that thing happened, but they don't seem to have the acquaintance with the events, the sort of firsthand acquaintance that the witness has. There's a sense in which they've judged truly, but they don't possess knowledge. And one thing that maybe can help us see this a little bit more deeply is that we can easily imagine a case in which the same things occur in the courtroom, but different things occurred outside of the courtroom. So the jury would have decided that the defendant was guilty, but they would have been wrong, right? And that's the difference. They don't have knowledge because their judgment is sort of independent. It's not directly connected with whether or not the things that happened really happened.
I don't want your nose to get long. I want you to tell me how it's an accident that stones that you were rolling on the ground hit somebody's car.
I rolled it, it bounced up on another
You rolled
rock.
it and it bounced up. A rock.
It hit another rock and it bounced.
That's a fib, Dylan. You're not supposed to fib anytime, especially not when you're in court.
You can judge truly by means of testimony, but it does seem like testimony is a different sort of access to information than having been right there. So now we come to the last of the accounts that Socrates and Theaetetus are going to consider, and that's the possibility that knowledge is true judgment with an account. So what the account adds, you might think, is an explanation or a rationale or some reasoning for the judgment. And the hope is that if you have that thing, which will fill out what it might be in a minute, if you have that thing, hopefully it'll bring your true judgment, your true belief, up to a level where it's not merely accidental. Where if you can give an account, maybe then you have a justification for your belief, and then maybe that thing that you've added is sufficient for knowledge. Before we get into kind of trying to dissect what it means to have an account, we'll first have to talk about what it is that the object is of what is believed or what is known. What is the thing that we know when we claim to know something? The issue is we want to know what our knowledge is knowledge of. And one of the reasons that that's an issue is remember that we've rejected the possibility that knowledge is perception. And we're trying to say that knowledge is true judgment with an account. And it seems like there are certain things that we are acquainted with that we can't give an account of, and some things that we seem to know that we can't give an account of. So remember how when we were talking about Moore claimed that there are just certain sort of basic things that we know that we don't have to be able to explain. Like, I just know that I have a hand. Just know it. It's basic. There's not any further reasoning, any further basis for justification that I can give beyond just, I have a hand. And in a sense, that seems like a case where I can't give an account of my having a hand. And if I can't give an account, does that mean then that I don't have knowledge? Well, partly that's going to depend on what giving an account is, and partly that's going to depend on what the thing is that I know. What is the object of my knowledge? Is this the object of my knowledge? Socrates introduces one proposal that is often called the dream theory. So the dream theory that Socrates says came to him in a dream, but really it's attributed to another pre-Socratic philosopher who might have suggested this. We think, we're not sure. The proposal, the dream theory, is the following. The things that make up all of the other things, the basic elements that make up the things around us, those things, they're so basic and maybe so tiny or maybe just so fundamental in a way that maybe we can perceive them, but we can't give an account of them. We can't explain them. We can't explain why they are, for example, why they exist. We just know that they do. But if we can't give an account of them, it seems to be the case, if we can't give an account, then we can't know them. On the other hand, it feels like, or it seems like, according to the dream theory, composite objects, things that are made up of the most basic things whose existence we can't explain, maybe those things are things we can give account of. So because they have multiple parts, we can say, we can list out the parts that they have, and by listing out the parts that they have and maybe how they're put together, how they're arranged, that might constitute an account. And so it seems like if the dream theory is correct, we can have an account, we can have knowledge of composite objects, while we can't give an account of the primary elements of things. So that would have it be the case that we can know about composite objects. For example, I can know about tables or chairs or houses. I can explain how a house is something that's made of walls that hold up a roof that enable human people to live inside of it or something like that. But I can't explain what the most fundamental particles that make up our universe are. I just don't have an account of them. I can give a name for them, but that's about all that I can do. And if the knowledge is true judgment with an account definition is correct, then it means that I can't know the most basic elements that make up the universe. I can't know those microphysical particles. I can only have true judgments with an account of things that are larger than, that are made up of those most basic elements. But Socrates thinks the dream theory is false, and there's kind of one set of reasons for this. So one question we can ask about this theory is what sorts of things the complexes are, right? And one example that Socrates considers is words. So words are made of syllables, syllables are made of letters. How can you know a syllable without knowing the letters? Socrates just thinks this is impossible. Either the syllable is the same thing as all of the letters, in which case you can know it just as well as you can know the letters. Like if you know the syllable, you must know the letters, and vice versa. Or if you can't know the syllable, it must be because you can't know the letters, or if you can't know the letters, it must be the case that you can't know the syllable. They seem to stand and fall together, unless we say that the parts are different than the whole. But that gets you into a whole other set of issues. So Socrates wants to leave aside that theory. He doesn't want to continue pursuing the dream theory, and instead he suggests a new proposal. And the new proposal is that maybe the elements that make everything up are things that are actually much more known, much better known than the complex for almost any branch of study, on his view. So Socrates is going to need to turn to a theory on which the basic things are more immediately knowable, and out of those basic things, you build out your knowledge of the non-basic things. So in order to understand how we can know the basic things, we need to get clear on what it means to have an account of those basic things. Because again, we're still utilizing that definition of knowledge from this part of the dialogue, the idea that knowledge is true judgment with an account. So if it turns out that we must know the elements better than we know the complexes, then we've got to be able to explain how we have an account of the elements such that we can know them better than the complex. We must be able to give an account if we are to have knowledge. So what does it mean to have an account? Socrates suggests there are three possible meanings of what having an account is. Having an account is a translation of the Greek word logos, and logos can be translated as speech, or an account, or like a telling, like a narrative, but it can also be translated as a reason or an explanation, or maybe even, although this is a bit trickier, a justification, right? And something like this comes out in Socrates' different suggestions for what he means by having an account. One possibility is that by having an account we mean speech. Here's a quote: "Making one's thought apparent vocally by means of words and verbal expressions," unquote. So maybe having an account of something means being able to express my thoughts about that something verbally. If I can express my thoughts about that thing verbally, then that would be having an account of a thing. But that just doesn't seem right to fit with our definition of knowledge, with fleshing out what an account means, because even people without knowledge can give speeches about their judgments, right? So all kinds of bullshitters are really good at talking about a particular object, whether or not they know anything about that object, or a particular subject, whether or not they know anything about that subject. I'm sure you can think of a million examples. So it can't be that having an account means being able to give a speech about something or being able to say some words about something. So the second proposal we'll consider is that maybe having an account means having a list of the elements that compose a particular object or a particular entity. So being able, he says, when questioned about what a thing is, to give an answer by reference to its elements. But this account doesn't work either, according to Socrates. Sometimes children can give all of the elements a name, but it doesn't mean that they have knowledge generally of how to spell. If you know all 26 letters of the English alphabet, you could hypothetically give a list of all of the letters in any one word, but it doesn't mean that the next time you are asked how that word is written, that you'll thereby be able to list the right elements in the right order. The third account we turn to of what an account is differentiation. So this is how Socrates puts it: being able to tell some mark by which the object you are asked about differs from all other things. So maybe having an account means being able to tell someone how the object you have in mind is distinct from everything else. What features it has that no other object has? What is it that makes it unique? And maybe if you can say what makes an object unique, you have arrived at a definition of the object, something that will help someone at least reliably pick out that object among every other kind of object you might come across. But this seems now to have a different problem, which is that it's a little bit too strict. It seems like the standard is too high, right? How am I then able to have singular thoughts about anybody at all? How am I able to think about, say, one of a pair of twins? It seems like you can have thoughts about just one member of a set of twins, right? But maybe you're not able to say exactly what it is that distinguishes that identical twin from their sibling. So it doesn't seem necessary for me to grasp or to know someone to be able to give a differentiation of them, how they're different from every other object. And also the problem with this last attempted definition of an account is that it seems to require knowledge of the differentness, which seems to be making our account circular. If knowledge is true judgment with an account, by which we mean differentiation, by which we mean knowledge of a different property that makes that object distinct, then we've built knowledge into the requirements of knowledge and we've gone in a loop, and that can't work. So where do we go from here? As a matter of fact, this is around when the dialogue ends. So the dialogue, the Theaetetus, leaves us in what we might call Aporia. That is, we are left without an answer to the question that we started with, which is we don't know the answer to the question, what is knowledge? It feels like we've whittled away at some possibilities. Some of them sounded more plausible than others. But here's two questions we can ask ourselves. One question is, have we exhausted the options? Have we gone through every single one of the ideas we could have about what knowledge is? That's a yes or no question. Either yes, we have, in which case there can be no analysis of knowledge, or no, we haven't, in which case we've got to keep looking, and maybe it's in the neighborhood of what we discussed. And that's the second thing we might come across, which is, did maybe one of the proposals that we heard about over the last few pages or a few minutes of this video did one of those suggestions have more merit to it than we gave it at a first glance? Could it be that one of the accounts that we rejected, one of the definitions of knowledge that we rejected, actually has some merit and maybe needs to be looked at again? If the answer to both questions is yes, we looked at all of the possibilities and no, none of the possibilities are more promising, then we have to conclude that there is no proper analysis of knowledge. But if it turns out that maybe there's a way to give a definition of knowledge that we haven't tried yet, or if it turns out that one of the definitions of knowledge that we did give actually can be defended in some way we haven't mentioned yet, then we might be in the clear. But what is clear is that we don't know yet what knowledge is. We haven't settled on what a successful definition of knowledge is. And you might feel a little bit frustrated by that. We want to know what it takes to be a knower. But I will point out that we've helped ourselves along significantly after treating Plato's Theaetetus, because we've touched on some key and core issues that will crop up again with this issue of what knowledge is. One of them is the issue of the relationship between knowledge of basic objects and knowledge of more complex things that depend on knowledge of those basic objects, and what that relationship is. Is it the case that we know the less basic objects better than the more basic objects? Is there no difference between the basic and the complex objects? Is knowledge just the same all the way around? Or is it the case maybe that we can know the basic objects better than we can know the more complex objects? Those are at least three views that we could have, and it feels like there's multiple things to say about what knowledge is if we settle on any one of those. Another thing that we've discussed that's related to that is the question of whether or not perception is a source of knowledge, or whether perception is just one avenue for getting beliefs, and that knowledge maybe requires some other thing, right? Some additional thing. Whether perception is sufficient for knowledge. Depending on what your account is of perception, we might end up thinking different things about what knowledge is and the status of knowledge. And in particular, the status of whether or not people who form different opinions of things based on different perceptions thereby each have legitimate knowledge, or whether it turns out that those people, don't have equal access to knowledge. One of them maybe knows when the other one doesn't. Maybe one of them was unlucky, or maybe one of them made a bad set of reasoning from the same sorts of, capacities that they have. So we're assuming that everybody has the same capacities, but maybe they're employed in a different way, right? So two people might be perceiving a scene, but one of them reasons wrong, and so one of them is right, one of them is wrong. These are all issues that are very important to the question of what knowledge is, and also to the question of what might be true. Because if we settle on an account of knowledge, we're also, in a way, settling on account of what counts as having a grasp of the truth. It either is the case that the truth is something that doesn't change, in a sense. From moment to moment, the things that are true might change. But the notion of truth is either something that doesn't change, or it's something that's entirely subjective. Socrates is definitely trying to come up with an account that will not make truth be subjective. And that's one of the reasons that we struggle. If you think that truth is entirely subjective, then none of this discussion will have been very compelling for you, because you will think that truth is arbitrary. It's just as arbitrary a notion, perhaps, as the notion of knowledge. And no one has any more legitimacy than anyone else. One reason not to go for that account, besides the ones mentioned in response to why knowledge is not just perception, is that it would make living in society a little bit tricky. Because if it were the case that everyone was right all the time in an equal way and had the same source of justification, but they still disagreed about things, then there would be no way to live in community, you might think, except by never really interacting with people who didn't agree with you, which would be a way of not living in community with those people. So we've got to find a way for us to be able, perhaps, to adjudicate between disagreements and sometimes help decide who is being reasonable and who has a grasp of the truth, and who maybe isn't being reasonable or maybe doesn't have a grasp of the truth. And those are different things. But there should be a way of doing that respectfully while also acknowledging that disagreements don't always mean that everybody is right. It must be the case that at least sometimes a disagreement means someone made a mistake somewhere. And we've got to be able to own up to when we ourselves are the ones who've made the mistake. So getting a definition of knowledge would be very helpful toward doing just that kind of thing, toward deciding, am I a person right now who knows? Or am I a person right now who has to sort of back down and do more research or observe the world more carefully or just work harder to try to figure out what's true? Tune in next time and we'll talk about more problems for the analysis of knowledge, and in particular a big issue with this last definition of knowledge as true judgment plus justification. Thanks everyone, see you next time.